I'm Jonathan Brent. I'm Executive Director of the YIVO Institute, and it's really great to have this wonderful turnout on Father's Day of all days. Thank you so much for coming. I apologize to those of you who were looking for an elevator and found it to be out of service, and I apologize for the inconvenience. This is a very, very important subject that we're going to hear about today. It's one where a great deal of research must be done. The Sovietization of the countryside, of the Pale, the whole process of Sovietization, especially in the ethnic enclaves, was a subject of the greatest importance in the Soviet political structure. Stalin gave a very important speech in 1923 before a group of Ukrainian writers in which he said that our job is to further the national cultures of the ethnic minorities. And of course, it was on that basis that the Soviet government, the Soviet regime, gained the support of the Ukrainians and many of the Jews in the Pale and in Ukraine. We will further the national literatures and the national cultures of the ethnic minorities, he said. In fact, we will further them to the point at which they become they realize their potential to such an extent that they disappear. And at the point at which they disappear, the state, in Stalin's own words, will have become everything. And when the state is everything, then the state too has disappeared because you no longer see it. Because the toothbrush you use, because the buggy you ride in, because the book you buy, because the food you eat is all Sovietized. And there is no room any longer for the personal, the private, the idiosyncratic. It was a tremendous project that was undertaken with the greatest care by those at the top. And so it's a great subject on many, many levels, and we're very privileged to have Elissa Bemporad talk to us about her new book, which unfortunately I have not yet had a chance to read, but which I certainly am going to read, and I encourage you all to purchase a copy. I want to emphasize that this is a lecture in the YIVO series, Sunday series of lectures on scholarly topics, and it's wonderful to see how many people are interested in what could be an academic subject, but which obviously has so much general interest in our world, in the YIVO world today. Elissa Bemporad holds the Jerry and William Unger Chair in Eastern European Jewish History and is Assistant Professor of History at Queens College, City University of New York. Dr. Bemporad was trained in Russian Studies at the University of Bologna and in Jewish Studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. She received her PhD in history from Stanford. Becoming Soviet Jews, the Bolshevik Experiment in Minsk, has been awarded the Frankel Prize in Contemporary History as an outstanding work in 20th century history. So, please welcome Elissa Bemporad.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for being here. It is really a pleasure to be here. And as Jonathan said, of course, Father's Day was not celebrated in the Soviet Union, but I want to wish all of you who are fathers a happy Father's Day nonetheless. I have tried to accomplish 3 closely intertwined goals with this book. The first is to write the biography of an Eastern European Jewish history, Eastern European Jewish city under the Soviets on the eve of World War II. The second is to tell the story. Can everybody hear me? Yes. The second is to tell the story of Jewish continuities in the midst of the Bolshevik transformation of society. And the third is to dispel some well-established myths about the pattern of accommodation into the Soviet system as experienced by the Jewish population into the interwar period. So these are my three goals in the book, and we will touch upon these three goals today. Together. So let me start with the issue of biography. Let me start by trying to give you a sense of Minsk, trying to get you acquainted with the city of Minsk. And I will do that by using three quotes here, so that you get a sense of the architecture of the city, the demographics of the city, and what the city looked like socially and culturally. So the first quote is by a 19th century Russian conservative, Pavel Shpilevsky, who wrote for a very well-known conservative Russian journal, Savremennik, and he traveled through the Pale of Settlement and other areas of Russia, and he wrote about what he saw in these cities. So just to give you a sense of what the city was like, this is what he writes. Minsk is one of the biggest and most beautiful cities of Western Russia. It is bigger and more stylish than Mohilev and Vitebsk. Most buildings are made of brick and have tiled roofs, and most streets are paved and tidy. Walking through the streets of Minsk in the mid-19th century, visitors notice the groves and alleys of the city garden, the building of the new market with its squared boulevard and Lutheran church, the high market square with its Russian Orthodox and Catholic churches, and the low market with their city hospital with its oval shape of a Greek temple stands. The most modern section of the city is the New Market or New Place. Here, city residents have access to importing goods from Vilna, Odessa, Moscow, Warsaw, together with the local goods produced in the Minsk clothing and shoe workshops, praised throughout Belorussia and exported to Kiev during the winter. Book dealers from Moscow come to this section of the city where the Minsk Public Library stands and furnish local bookshops, well supplied with Polish, French, and German books, with the latest Russian publications. The city's leisure institutions are clustered in the High Market, the Casino, which hosts parties during the carnival, the theaters, the acrobatic performances, the inns, coffee houses, and the most popular restaurant of all, Fogel and Cybulski, right? So this is what he writes. And he wrote actually a few essays about Minsk. This is just an excerpt to give you a sense of the city, but he does acknowledge elsewhere, with a hint of regret actually, the Jewishness of Minsk. After all, let me remind you that by the 19th century, the majority of the population in Minsk was Jewish. Almost 53% of the population was Jewish, so that you have a minority of Russians, Poles, and Belarusians. So, but it is with a hint of regret that he reminds the reader of the Jewishness of Minsk, not devoid of this kind of anti-Jewish prejudice typical of 19th century Russian conservatives. His vivid portrayal dwelled on the lower market, also known as the Old City, Stary Gorod, or the Alte Stott. This was the city's main Jewish quarter, dominated by the Jewish square, its small businesses, and on the Sabbath, the distinctive odors of the holiday meal. The High Market was also overwhelmingly Jewish, he reminds us, the residence of wealthy Jewish merchants who traded in clothing and silk, and the site of the first Jewish state school established in the city, situated next to the cathedral. The school was inaugurated in 1845, thanks to the initiative of some of the most prominent Jews of Minsk, as well as the support of civil authorities. Despite the staunch opposition of the local Orthodox establishment, which in 1841 had forced out of the city through curses and snowballs, as we read, the Maskil Max Lilienthal for trying to establish a Jewish state school, the Haskalah dream did eventually succeed. And the Ministry of Education introduced Russian, of course, into the school's curriculum. Minsk became one of the most prominent Haskalah, meaning Jewish enlightenment, centers in the northwestern provinces of the Russian Empire. So you're starting to get a sense of Minsk, right, before 1917. The second quote is by a very distinguished Talmud scholar, mid-19th century. The second quote is by a very distinguished distinguished Talmud scholar. I hope that some of you have at least heard his name, Sol Lieberman, born in 1898 in the city of Pinsk, present-day Belarus. He arrived in Minsk in 1915. And he immediately noticed that it made the impression of a large city where everyone was Jewish. I had not yet seen such a Jewish city, he writes. He recalled a hot summer day, strolling with his elderly uncle, a rabbi from the nearby shtetl of Lohoysk, in Minsk's old city, on a narrow street known in Yiddish as Zwischen die Kromen, amongst the stores. And because of the heat and the small number of customers, the shopkeepers were sitting outside their stores and they were chatting. As his uncle approached the shops, one by one the shopkeepers stood up and, out of respect for the rabbi, formed around him a long line as if they were soldiers. Lieberman writes, I had never seen anything like that anywhere else. This was a rabbi they did not know, but recognizing him as such because of his garments and appearance, they remained standing until he crossed the street. And finally, a reference to, this is a saying in Yiddish that was really applied to the two sister cities, Vilna and Minsk, that appears in the memoirs of Danil Charny, the youngest brother of critic Shmuel Niger, who I hope some of you have heard of. And this is how he refers to Minsk and Vilna, and by using this expression, he really captures the close, but at the same time, hierarchical relationship existing between the two cities, as he refers to them as a Stub mit a Kamer, which means a house with a chamber, the house being, of course, Vilna, and the chamber being Minsk. I'll show you, you'll see in a map how close the two cities are from one to the other, 160 kilometers. So the phrase denoted the supremacy of Vilna, of course, over Minsk, but also the interdependence and familiarity between these two historic Jewish centers. So, based on these quotes, what do we have here? What kind of city do we have? We have, of course, a historic Jewish center located in the heart of the Pale of Settlement. Right, everybody can see where Minsk is. Vilna is right here. This is the Pale of Settlement. So it's a densely populated by Jews, a city that, like Vilna, developed in the Litvish or Lithuanian tradition, favoring the analytical and rationalist approach to Jewish lore over the mystical one endorsed by Hasidism, right? Generally more rooted in southern Russia, Poland. In the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, the city turned into a well-known center of religious scholarship, competing in fame with other Torah centers in Eastern Europe, one of them Vilna. At the end of the 19th century, Yudale Perelman, also known as the Great Scholar of Minsk, or Der Minsker Godel, served as a rabbi in one of the largest yeshivas in Minsk. Minsk had 83 synagogues on the eve of, on the eve of 1917, synagogues including buildings, but also houses of prayer and minyanim. Only 3 of these 83 were Hasidic, which again gives you a sense of the city. So Minsk develops really in the same cultural tradition as Vilna, not only though in its approach to religious scholarship. The success of the Haskalah and of socialist-oriented movements was also a very specific trait of the Lithuanian region. At the end of the 19th century, Minsk became one of the largest centers of Jewish socialism. Not only Bundists, but also Poalei Zion, also socialist Zionism. So in the Russian Empire, in terms of, Bund, and socialist movement, there's Vilna and there's Minsk, and then there's Bialystok. So these are the 3 main centers. If you want to know more about what happened to the Bund under the Soviets, you have to buy my book and read chapter 3, because I'm not going to talk about it. So all of this brings me to the crucial question that fascinated me and intrigued me when I first embarked on my long research journey that moved me through 3 different continents. I started, of course, here at YIVO, because this is where a scholar in East European Jewry starts. Then I went to Jerusalem, then I went to Moscow, and finally I went to Minsk, where I spent almost 1 year. And while I can say that being in Minsk was not that exciting from the vantage point of social life, it was one of the most extraordinary, exciting archival experiences in my career, since I worked on documents that nobody had ever seen before, right? So the question that intrigued me was, what happened to such a Jewish city? What happened to its inhabitants as the city and its inhabitants encounter the Bolshevik experiment and contribute to the Bolshevik experiment also? How did the Bolshevik experiment, which, let's remember, created through terror and violence a one-party system, an official atheistic communist culture, and a culture that destroyed or attempted to destroy the buffer zone between private life and public life. What happened to such a Jewish city and its inhabitants? So my book really, what my book does, it examines the dynamic encounter. You can just see where Minsk is vis-a-vis the borders of the Soviet Union and Poland. So it really examines the dynamic encounter between pre-revolutionary Jewish life and the new communist agencies and organizations that the Bolsheviks set up in the city. The exploration of Jewish social, culture, and daily life under the Bolsheviks really reveals how intricate and inconsistent the Sovietization process and the patterns of Jewish accommodation were. This process was not as linear and hardly ever uniform as as many scholars have assumed. It depended on a variety of factors, ranging from the social settings in which the individual operated and interacted with others, to the different views held by the individual and the options that Soviet society proffered to him or to her. These factors included, of course, enthusiasm for communist ideology, ambition to succeed, quest for employment, anxiety to fit in, necessity to survive, fear of marginalization and punishment, as well as pressures from family, friends, and fellow residents. In spite of the variety of settings, views, and options, the ways in which all the members of the Jewish group experienced their path to Sovietization in Minsk was, of course, shaped by the character of the city itself. That's why I dwelled so much on what the city was like before 1917. Minsk was a historic Jewish center long before the establishment of the Soviet Union, a historic Jewish city since the 16th century that was transformed, and this is unique actually in Jewish history, it was transformed into the capital of a Soviet republic. So you have a Jewish city that becomes the capital of a Soviet republic, the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. And this influenced the complicated process of give and take between Jewish particularity and Soviet universal ideas that characterizes the process of becoming Soviet Jews. So in other words, in spite of Lenin's violent rhetoric and the quick tempo with which the Bolsheviks hoped to revolutionize Russian society and bring socialism to the world, the transformation of the core of Jewish life occurred at a slower pace and is in historic Jewish centers in the Pale of Settlement, where the majority of Jews, Soviet Jews, lived until the eve of World War II. That's where the majority of Jews lived, not in the Russian metropolises of Moscow and Leningrad. So geography did curb the intended radical consequences of the Bolshevik experiment, which was, as Jonathan also reminded us, complete assimilation of the Jewish minority group into the Soviet family of peoples, and impinged on the intensity with which the communist project took hold of the Jewish street, facilitating the preservation of lines of continuity with pre-revolutionary Jewish life. "This is my revolution," wrote Solomon Grimberg in the autobiography he submitted to the Communist Party of Belorussia, applying for party membership in 1928. The son of a Melamed, the teacher in a Jewish religious elementary school and grandson of a carpenter. Solomon was born in Bobruisk, Minsk gubernia, the Minsk province, where since the age of 12 he had worked as an apprentice hairdresser from 8 in the morning till 11 at night with limited knowledge of Russian. His mother tongue, of course, was Yiddish. He explained to the party organization that the long workday forced him to remain illiterate and prevented him from understanding anything about the February Revolution. As soon as the October Revolution, meaning when Lenin takes over, broke out, he writes, I instinctively felt that this was my revolution. I immediately sided with the Bolsheviks, supported their conspiratorial work, and enrolled as a volunteer in the Red Army, where I served until 1923. I now work as a hairdresser in Minsk. So in poor Russian, Solomon concluded the autobiography by trying to convince the local cell of the Communist Party of Belorussia to accept him. I recognize the party as the vanguard of the working class and believe in the duty of every conscious worker to join it and fight against world capitalism for a world revolution. Now, whether Solomon applied for party membership out of belief, enthusiasm, conformity, or opportunism, the revolution gave him the option to become part of its elite and opened the path to potential success in Soviet society. Of course, let us remember that success had a price for all those willing to embrace it. While opening its doors to Russian Jewry, the Soviet regime banned Jewish political organizations outside the Communist Party, denied religious Jews and their institutions the right to continue playing a role in Jewish life, and destroyed a wide range of autonomous Jewish organizations. The Bolshevik leadership conveyed to its citizenry a clear message. Those who did not conform to the views and codes of belief of the new Soviet system would suffer the consequences. The combination of freedoms granted, let us remember that, I'm taking maybe a lot for granted, but Russian Jews were emancipated in 1917, right? So the combination of freedoms granted to and constraints enforced on Soviet Jewish citizens entailed numerous changes in the political, cultural, and religious identity. Some Jews eagerly embraced the universal possibility of a classless society in which national identity would eventually disappear and be replaced by the Marxist idea of the merging of nations. They rushed into government offices and institutions of higher learning and readily disassociated themselves from all vestiges of their Jewish identity and background. Sons and daughters rebelled against their Zionist, Bundist, or religious fathers and mothers, integrated into Soviet society, and came to form the backbone of the new Soviet intelligentsia. For those Jews who, as one historian put it, partook in the Jewish social rise, Jewish patricide, and Jewish conversion to non-Jewishness, integration meant escaping religious, cultural, and political Jewish particularity. But the straightforward, rapid path to acculturation into the Soviet system should not be ascribed to Soviet Jewry as a whole. In many of the medium to large urban centers with a sizable proportion of Jews and located in the pre-1917 territory of the Pale, such as Minsk, the response to the Bolshevik emancipation project in the 1920s and 1930s was multifaceted. And as I say, it wasn't circumscribed to communism as anti-Jewishness and Jewishness as anti-communism. In other words, while adapting to the new system, many Jews, whether former Bundists, Yiddish activists, political Zionists, religious practicing Jews, or Russified liberals, remained committed to some expressions of Jewishness and attempted to walk the fine line between accepted Soviet behavior and social norms and expressions of Jewish particularity. Now, like all places, Minsk was a unique city with distinctive traits. In the Soviet landscape of urban centers, as I said before, this was the only Jewish city that became the capital of a republic. As the new political and administrative hub of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic intersected with a historic Jewish center in the Pale of Settlement. The geopolitical transformation of the city produced an intensification of communist activities, right? Exposing the new capital to a thorough and systematic Sovietization process. As a Soviet capital, Minsk attracted a high concentration of Bolshevik official institutions, more than other pre-revolutionary Jewish centers did. And it served as a kind of lighthouse to spread communism through Belorussia, through the Belarusian Republic. This distinct characteristic can therefore reveal aspects of the Sovietization process that remain elusive in places that did not house as many party institutions and Soviet administrative offices, right? The more communist institutions sprung up in Minsk, the more radical and intense became the thrust to accept or embrace Bolshevism. But despite these exceptional features, I would say that in many ways Minsk remained a very ordinary Jewish city. With a large Jewish population throughout the interwar period, Minsk can be used as a case study to investigate adjustment to and participation in the Bolshevik experiment as it occurred in most urban centers in the former Pale. Many towns and cities in the Jewish heartland shared Minsk's demographic profile, both in Belorussia and in Ukraine. The Jewish density of Minsk, but also of Gomel, of Berdichev, of Zhytomyr, of Vinnytsia, and even to some degree of Kiev and Odessa, fostered self-confidence and comfort about Jewish identity, a feeling that generally did not exist in the cities outside the Pale. In this demographic context, family ties and friendship networks made allegiance to Jewish identity more common and multifaceted. And while the most acculturated Jews, many of whom were largely indifferent to their Jewish background, left for Moscow and Leningrad in haste, usually without parents and relatives, the fairly more traditional Jews from the Shtetl poured into the cities, impacting the urban ecology of the Jewish population. Combined with Jewish self-confidence, demographics yielded a less traumatic version of Sovietization, as the centripetal forces of assimilation that would have drawn Jews away from their Jewish identity were countered, or at least tamed, by the centrifugal forces of a heavily Jewish city. So in Minsk, as in so many other places, the path to Sovietization did not involve a complete denial or departure from Jewishness, but allowed for the possibility of retaining aspects of Jewish identity that might have otherwise been cast off in the acculturation process. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that here, acting as a Jew and a Bolshevik could sometimes coexist, intersect, and harmoniously meet, as the making of Soviet Jews resulted not only from the violent changes introduced by the communist project, but also by the largely overlooked lines of continuity with pre-revolutionary Jewish life. So as I said, most Soviet Jews attempted to walk this fine line between accepted Soviet behavior and expressions of Jewish identity. So I want to dwell on a few, forms of expression of Jewish identity. I will dwell on 3 of them. And I will start actually with the one that is related to the Yiddish language, since, we are here at YIVO, so I thought that this was made a lot of sense, and it seems very appropriate. So during the interwar period, Minsk grew to be one of the capitals of the Yiddish language and culture in Eastern Europe, I would say. And what the book does, it really analyzes the way in which the language became part, and this is something new, became part of Soviet bureaucracy. It is used as a language of bureaucracy, of course, as a language of education, and but also the way in which the language grows in the field of culture and in the field of everyday life, in the area of everyday life on the Jewish streets. So I would just want to show you some images of the language as and the new function that it plays within the context of everyday life in the in the public sphere. So this is the central train station, and as you can see, the name of the city not only appears in Belarusian, Russian, and Polish, but it also appears in Yiddish. And I just want to read together with you a quote by Yudhud Zinger, the brother of Bolshevik Zinger, who visited Minsk in 1928. And as you can see, he wrote, "These four languages, Belarusian, Russian, Polish, and Yiddish, meet me at the train station. They look down at me from the gray wall. I come across them at every step, in every commissariat, office, everywhere there are signs in the four languages. The fact that Yiddish appeared in public spaces on the streets of the city," continued the writer, "is now something normal. The only one who marvels at this is probably me." Of course, he was in Poland. It was something that this, was not common. So home to numerous new pedagogic, academic, and cultural institutions functioning in Yiddish, Minsk attracted hundreds of Jews from cities and shtetl of the Soviet Union eager to settle in a Jewish city, but also to partake in the Yiddish, to participate in the building of Yiddish language institutions. So, I argue that the Yiddish experiment was, of course, was a quintessential product of the Bolshevik experiment and grew out of the Soviet nation-state building project. But the support for Yiddish also relied, of course, on solid pre-existing foundations and was not entirely enforced top to bottom. Here you see the Bielorusski Dziajourny Universitet in Belarusian and in Yiddish. So this is Belarusian State University, established in Minsk in 1921. And the name of the university appears only in Belarusian and Yiddish, the languages of the two largest national groups who lived in the city. The high proportion, and I'll get back to this in a moment, the high proportion of Yiddish-speaking Jews, the deeply rooted Bundist tradition of the region, the relatively small size and provincial character of Minsk, the lack of support for the Belarusian language, and the idiosyncratic character of Belarusian nationalism were all factors that contributed to the success of the Yiddish experiment in Minsk. Here I'm showing you another example of, Yiddish being displayed in the public space. This is the Uniwersalny magazine, which is the kind of cooperative that sold all products, right, from food to shoes. And this actually I got from, this is an émigré journal that was published in Paris. So, for those of you who know Russian, this is the Babylonian mixture of language. They're not too happy about the fact, as they tell us here, that the Russian language occupies only the second place as opposed to, right, because the Russian, Polish, and Yiddish. Although for us, since, we started first, right? Okay. So this is an example, again, from everyday life, and I want to give you, I want to finish with this kind of expression of Jewish identity by telling you that, sorry, although I think my voice is powerful enough, but in all probability, Minsk also became the only capital city in Europe where, as late as 1937, one could see a truck passing through the city streets. Follow me carefully, okay? Passing through the city streets, distributing bread to local cooperatives with the writing bread on it in Yiddish. Actually, as someone noticed at the time, lamenting the level of ignorance and provincialism of the text of the bread lorry, the writing did not appear in standardized literary Yiddish, but in Litvish Yiddish, or the dialect spoken in Minsk and its surroundings. So instead of reading broit, or bread in standard Yiddish, the text on the truck read breit, right? Breit, which in the Litvish dialect indeed means bread, but in standard Yiddish means wide. Okay. Oh, here I also wanted to show you this is pretty well-known image of the Belarusian Jewish State Theater, the former Zionist shul in Minsk. This is on the stage, 1937, which, by the way, I don't know how many of you know Nina Rogov, who works in the archives at YIVO as a volunteer, and she appears. She's from Minsk, and she appears. She's one of the performers on stage. Yiddish on the street, Soviet Jewish schools. These are all images that appear in the book. So the second case of expression of Jewish identity has to do with circumcision. In the interwar period, most Soviet Jews practiced circumcision. And actually, among the most fascinating archival documents I found, and I bring in my book, are those related to the practice of circumcision. In general, religious practices and customs deeply embedded in the daily life of the city often defied the Soviets' agenda of making a kind of tabula rasa, you know, of destroying completely the past and of erasing century-long traditions. This has to do not only with Jews, but with non-Jews also, of course. Providing a religious education to one's child, and let me just remind you in parenthesis that the largest yeshiva, underground yeshiva, of course there were underground yeshivas that existed in the Soviet Union, was in Minsk until 1931. So providing a religious education to one's child, attending synagogue, purchasing kosher meat. I'm sorry, this is the Jewish quarter. And I just wanted to show you, this is the cupola of the main synagogue in Minsk. So this is kosher meat being sold in Minsk. So purchasing kosher meat or circumcising one's newborn son not only depended on the intensity of anti-religious persecution and discrimination, it also varied according to the individual's perseverance and ability to camouflage his or her compliance with religious tenets, as well as on the social networks in which he or she operated. I was so surprised when sitting in the archives in Minsk, it's already 8 years ago, I found out about the following case. In the beginning, I couldn't believe it, but I'll just tell you about this case. This is September 1929, and the construction worker, whose name is Orman, employed in a Minsk state factory, and he is a member of the Communist Party, he addressed a letter of complaint to party officials because a local Soviet Jewish kindergarten, in Yiddish language kindergarten, refused to accept his son. And the reason, he stated, was that his son, who I presume was born in 1922, had not been circumcised. So as the text goes in Russian, «Его ребенок особо виду не совершенно над ним обряда обрезания». So, you know, he wasn't circumcised. At first, the possibility of such a case occurring in the late 1920s in the capital of a Soviet republic seemed to me highly remote. I was very skeptical, especially based on the scholarship that is available on Russian Jews post-1917, meaning Soviet Jews. As a Soviet institution, the kindergarten was, at least in theory, committed to conveying to the younger generation and to the parents the ideals of communism, which included among its core foundations an atheistic approach to the world and a passionate denigration of religious beliefs. However, viewing the worker's letter within the context of the widespread observance of this Jewish practice allows us to reconsider the nature of the case, therefore complicating our understanding of Jewish integration in Soviet society. During the 1920s and through the late 1930s, at least circumcising one's son was the norm among Soviet Jews, not the exception. This norm could have led, at least in, in the area of the former Pale of Settlement, but no one has really looked at that in Moscow. So I can't, but I assume that in Moscow that's not the case. This norm could have led some Jews to view with disfavor children who had not been circumcised, and could even have been shared by the personnel of an official Soviet institutions such as the Soviet Jewish kindergarten, the Soviet Yiddish kindergarten. After all, this was probably the first time that a Jewish child who was not circumcised applied to attend that kindergarten. So this is just a quote. These are a few quotes I'm giving you here from Communist Party officials and members. The performance of circumcisions among workers who are members of a Communist Party and are employed in the factories of the city of Minsk is so widespread that it has assumed a chronic character. It has become an epidemic. And then another quote, in a few months we will have another baby, says a member of the Communist Party who had the first son circumcised and was caught by doing that, stated the party member to the party cell, and I swear that there will be no bris. So if what is the problem here? If a significant proportion of Jewish party members perform the ritual, and the documents that we have are about party members, right, not about non-party members, we must assume that circumcision was even more common among those Jews, workers and non-workers alike, who did not belong to the Communist Party. The commitment to the practice of circumcision on the part of Jewish communists should not be necessarily seen as an indication of religious behavior, by the way, although I included in the chapter on religious behavior. Circumcising one's newborn son was rather perceived, at least by many Jewish communists who had it privately performed, as the expression of ethnic identification and was the outgrowth of a specifically Jewish mentalité, right? Mentality, which even communists found difficult to renounce. This is just another quote. Jewish workers still abide strictly by the tradition of circumcision, even when they do not attend synagogue or believe in God, and a communist who carried out a circumcision cannot be a model of behavior for non-party members. This act concerns not only Gorlin, which was one of the cases that I discussed in the book, but the party as a whole. Meaning that if those Jews who were not members of the Communist Party see what or find out what the members of the Communist Party are doing, then that will kind of encourage their, behavior unbecoming of a Soviet, right? How did they find out? By the way, they created an investigative commission made of 3 people, each party cell, and every single organization. I don't know how much people know about this, the structure at the lower levels of Soviet society, but every single organization, institution had a party cell, right? Because there were always members of the party who belonged or worked for that institution. So if there was a large number of Jews in that organization or institution or factory, then an investigative committee was created of 3 people. And when the child was born, they would go to the home to see of the Communist Party member to make sure that the child had not been circumcised. And in the case in which he was circumcised, because circumcision is actually never outlawed in the Soviet Union, but in the case in which the child was circumcised, then the member of the party was usually kicked out of the party, especially once we get to the 1930s. But communists, what they did, they relied on, they used their wives as a kind of foil, meaning that they accused their wives of being the backward religious members of society who, I was away because for a business trip, and look at what my wife did. So you should not kick me out of the party. The wife, anyway, she's not a member of the party, so it doesn't really affect them. I just wanted to show this quote that appeared in the Jewish daily that was issued in Minsk until 1941. This is 1936. I advise all the Moelim of Minsk not to circumcise my son. If my son will be circumcised, I will hold responsible each and every Mohel in Minsk, which means probably that the son had already been circumcised or this is being used as a device. You know, I warned everybody, but I should not be kicked out of the party because, you know, I did. It's not my fault, right? I did try to be proactive. Okay, so one last point, and then I'll move on to my conclusions, that I want to make in order to fully convey what this book is about. And this is actually from my favorite chapter, which is the last chapter of the book, which deals with the late 1930s. It deals with the terror, it deals with the purges, but it also deals with a very unique kind of synthesis between Soviet patriotism and Jewish identity and expressions of Jewish identity. So the chapter really looks at ordinary Jewish life, everyday Jewish life in the late 1930s, at the height of Stalin's Great Terror. The existence in Minsk of compact Jewish neighborhoods, combined with the ongoing influx of shtetl residents and the role of Yiddish in the public sphere, contributed to the preservation of an intensive Jewish ethnic identity. Despite the violence with which the purges impinged on the Jewish street, they did not constitute the end of Jewish life. The terror's vigor, enhanced by the geopolitical character of the city. I showed you the map of where Minsk is located. It's very close to Poland. That's why the purges in Minsk affected, in a very violent way, every single national minority. The Poles first and the Jews second, much more than it did in other cities. Like Kiev is further removed from the fascist other side, right? So all of this wiped out the bulk of Jewish cultural elite and institutions in Minsk, perhaps more than anywhere else in the Soviet Union. But the terror mostly affected the party, professional and intellectual leadership. What is interesting is that there was a very widespread knowledge of what was happening to the Jews of fascist Poland, as the Soviets refer to it, and the Jews, what was happening to the Jews in Nazi Germany in the late 1930s. And combined with the awareness of the absence of official anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, this led to a kind of sustained Jewish self-confidence and built up the self-perception that Soviet Jews embodied the true vanguard of world Jewry. As never before, these kind of seemingly opposite factors of Soviet patriotism and commitment to Jewishness converged rather harmoniously in the late 1930s, 1936, 1939. And continuities of solidarity with other Jewries also resurfaced during the late 1930s. The sense of Jewish commonality and fellow feeling that had distinguished pre-revolutionary life emerged once again in the late 1930s. So what you are allowed to say in the late 1930s, you were not allowed to say in the 20s, and you will not be allowed to say after 1945. As Jews looked toward the West with growing concern, they experienced the forgotten sense of belonging to world Jewry as a whole. Throughout the 20s and 30s, Soviet Jews had been forced to sever all ties with other Jewries around the world because they were bourgeois, Zionist, or religious. Now, for the first time in a long time, they could reconnect emotionally with them and even experience a renewal of Jewish identity. And this is captured in this quote that appeared in the Soviet Jewish press at the time, that glorious Jewry. You would not have been able to say that glorious Jewry in the 1920s, and definitely not after 1945. So that glorious Jewry, which produced the famous names of Moses Mendelssohn, Heinrich Heine, Karl Marx, Albert Einstein, has been destroyed by the fascist cannibals who exiled their children, requisitioned their property, and kicked out the best thinkers, burning their work. So similar expressions of Jewish national pride and solidarity complicate our understanding of Jewish life in the late 1930s and counter the assumption that Stalin's Great Terror, the purging of Jewish intellectuals and the closing down of Yiddish institutions entailed the complete removal of all expressions of Jewish identity in the Soviet context. And now to my conclusions. What you will learn from my book is what we really did lose. We lost cities such as Minsk, where 40% of the population was Jewish, and where Jews had a very intense social and cultural life. Unlike Jewish histories elsewhere in Europe, the Soviet Jewish story, as a product of the voices and experiences of the densely populated cities and towns of the former Pale of Settlement, underwent a distinctive form of destruction, loss, and oblivion during World War II. Of course, the first and most brutal form of destruction was carried out by the Nazis and their local collaborators, who almost completely annihilated Minsk Jewry. The physical destruction of the vast majority of Minsk Jews, almost 80,000, who were killed between 1941 and 1943, within the boundaries of the city itself, actually at the site of the Minsk ghetto, which included also the Jewish cemetery. So the loss of Minsk Jews, of course, produced an irreparable loss. The onslaught of the city and the destruction of its streets, houses, Jewish quarters, institutions wiped out by the German bombs launched during the offensive of the summer of 1941 further obliterated the memory of this community. Almost all buildings in the center of the city had been demolished, as well as the railway station. We saw an image of it. Hundreds of industrial enterprises, most schools, institutes of higher education, including Belarusian State University, and 80% of the housing. Unlike Vilna and Grodno, where the physical annihilation of the Jews was at least mediated by the preservation of most of their Jewish historic urban spaces, Minsk was razed to the ground. When Hersh Smolyar, who was a well-known Jewish communist, returned to Minsk after the war, he walked through the city in ruins, through its streets, searching for the buildings he had once known so well. He looked for the Writers' Union building on Sovietskaya Street in vain. Some 60 years later, during the many months I spent in Minsk to conduct the bulk of the research on which this book is based, I also walked through the streets of the city in search of the places I had seen in pre-war photos and read about in archival documents, press reports, history accounts, oral history accounts. But most of the places described in this book really can only be imagined because they're no longer there. With the post-World War II reversal of the Bolshevik emancipation projects, Soviet universalism and brotherhood of peoples largely rejected the Jews. The new Cold War geopolitical order, in combination with the establishment of the State of Israel, led them to be considered the most unreliable and foreign ethnic group in the Soviet Union, whose patriotism, that we discussed earlier, could only be distrusted. Expressions of state anti-Semitism range from anti-Jewish quotas at universities and government posts, accusations of cosmopolitanism and arrests of students for allegedly organizing Zionist cells following the 1953 unmasking of the so-called doctors' plot, or the alleged conspiracy of Jewish medical assassins of Soviet leaders in Moscow. Jewish doctors were arrested in Minsk as well. In 1951, the executive committee of the Minsk City Council closed down the Jewish cemetery on Sukhaya Street and refused to allow any further burials there on the grounds of a lack of space. A group of Jews petitioned the Minsk City Council, asking it to fence off the territory of the cemetery in order to prevent pigs, goats, and cows from grazing there. Despite the petitioners' claim that great revolutionary Jews who gave their life for the revolution were buried there, the appeal fell on deaf ears. Only one synagogue functioned in Minsk from 1946 to the mid-1960s, which was located on Nemiga Street that I showed you earlier, and was headed by Rabbi Yaakov Yosef Berger until 1956. This last synagogue in the Belarusian capital was closed down in 1964 and demolished. The building was also demolished. The atmosphere of anxiety persisted among Jews in the post-Stalin years. In the early 1960s, the campaign against the so-called economic crimes targeted overwhelmingly Jews, drawing on the anti-Semitic stereotype of Jews as money grubbers. In 1962, 54% of the 84 persons sentenced to death for economic offenses throughout the Soviet Union were Jews. The money-grubbing Jew stereotypes resurfaced in the context of the anti-religious campaign of the early 1960s, specifically in the attacks on the barbarian practice of circumcision. When the Mohel Aaron Lifshitz moved from Vilna to Minsk to perform circumcisions, he was accused of charging the enormous sum of 500 rubles per circumcision. The local newspaper Minskaya Pravda, The Truth of Minsk, stated in 1961, "Money, that is the god of the Minsk Jewish religious community and their aides." In stark contrast with the interwar period, anti-Semitism was aided by the Minsk authorities. And in the absence of Jewish cultural institutions, and after 1964, of religious institutions, anti-Semitism became perhaps the single most important factor in sustaining Jewish identity in Minsk. Post-war accounts of the city's history generally suppressed its Jewish character. Besides the mention, just very briefly in passing, that Jews were one of the groups that inhabited the city, the Minsk main entry of the 1954 Great Soviet Encyclopedia made no reference to its past Jewishness, to the fact that it was once called the Jerusalem of Belorussia, that Yiddish had been an official state language before the war, or that the city's Jews had been exterminated by the Germans. Tourist guidebooks of the Belarusian capital neglected to make the slightest allusion to the Jews of Minsk. The long and detailed historical overview included in a 1971 Minsk travel guide did not incorporate any reference to its past Jewish demographics. While it referred to the names of prominent Belarusian and Russian writers of the 1920s and 30s, who, by the way, were purged but rehabilitated, it failed to mention Jewish writers like Izicharik or Moshe Kulbak, who were also purged and rehabilitated. The historical overview did not mention any of the Jewish culture and academic institutions that had once existed in the city, and did not care to remind tourists of the role that Yiddish had once played in the life of many of its Jewish residents. Throughout the entire guide, the only allusion to the Jews of Minsk was at the time of their destruction, when the authors admitted that 80,000 perished in the ghetto. So, this book is also intended as an attempt to memorialize the community of Soviet Jews that existed in Minsk before World War II, their lifestyle, culture, identity, as well as the geography of the city in which they lived, a community that was first brutally erased from history and then knowingly removed from public memory. Thank you. And now you all have to go and buy a copy of the book right now. Go. Yes?
You mentioned several times that Jews were streaming in from the shtetl to Minsk. Was that true of other cities? And why particularly?
Well, the Soviets targeted, to some degree, the shtetl, meaning that as part of their policy to Sovietize the Jewish population, they destroyed the marketplace, which was, the shtetl lived off the marketplace. So you have thousands and thousands of young Jews who stream into the cities, but I just want to mention that this was actually a phenomenon that started at the end of the 19th century. We see this already. So much so that we can say that only 50% of Russian Jews were living in the shtetl at the end of the 19th century. But this phenomenon becomes massive under the Soviets. So there is the economic reason, right? Reconstructing or building a new economy that can no longer be based on the marketplace. But there also is this kind of natural flowing into the larger cities that was happening even before the Soviets came. But once the Soviets come, and it's not only Jews, it's millions and millions of non-Jews. I mean, the Bolshevik experiment, as one social historian of the Soviet Union put it, changed the face of the cities, of Russian cities, because you have millions and millions of peasants who are now living in the cities. There is, of course, Chabad, and they've managed to build actually a very impressive building in Minsk. The last time I was in Minsk was in 2007. And they had not yet inaugurated the building. You have a kind of a JCC, which is funded by, it's not called JCC, but it's a kind of JCC funded by the JDC, which is a very, very impressive building that has, adult education, seminars, and children's programs. And there, the reform movement holds its, comes together only on Friday night. And then you have an Orthodox minyan that also meets in Minsk, or at least that was when I was there for that year. That's what was going on, and a number of students from YU who go to Minsk. And the question about the numbers, I mean, the numbers, that's always a very tricky question when you talk about Soviet Jews and, who is a Jew and who identifies as a Jew. Is it halachically, is it by father? And, it's very... An estimate is, the largest community is in Minsk. So some people talk about 20,000 Jews.
Do you have any cemeteries still at the moment?
So there is a cemetery, but the historic cemeteries, were complete. I could have shown you an image. Actually, I just want to share with you that these images that I just showed to you, these are the Jews of Minsk were being, herded into the ghetto. So we know that these people perished. But these are the people that I wrote about. So for me, it was very moving when I found these images in the archives here. The archives here are always surprise me. You think you have everything, and then you find. And Krisha Fisher, who works here, of course, YIVO made for me these the reproduction very quickly because I wanted to show you. But I also have images of synagogues, and I have one image of the Jewish cemetery that was, as I said, it was used by Minsk Jews during the Soviet period, but it was on the territory of the ghetto, so it was completely destroyed. But we have that one image that is here in the archives.
Other part, Grodno and other cities in Belorussia, about the Jewish communities there in Grodno and
okay, maybe we can talk about this later. I mean, I was in Grodno, which is a beautiful city, and but a very different. Grodno was Sovietized at a later time, right? Grodno was Polish, was under Poland. Today it's Belarus, but it was Sovietized starting 1945. Well, even before, once you have Western Belarus, but yeah. I think yes, you were first.
When exactly did the Yiddish language disappear from official buildings?
1938. In 1938, Yiddish and Polish are no longer considered state languages in the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. So that if you see, I have an image from the building of the train station, which I could have showed, but okay, from 1939, and there the name of the city only appears in Russian and in Belarusian.
Here is food for thought.
Mm-hmm.
1938, fast forward to 2000, and go to Brooklyn, and on every single drugstore, it says Bet Merkachat. This is the USA.
Although bet merkachat is not Yiddish, but no, I'm joking. No. But this is the golden Medina, of course. You know, it has to be that way. But Europe, I know. But Europe is Europe. I mean, this is. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think the gentleman in the back. Yes, you were first, and then. Okay, very good questions. I thought you could hear there. So the first question has to do with the pogroms. Were there pogroms in Minsk in the 19th century, late 19th century? But also, I assume you're also referring to World War I, Polish occupation, and the Civil War, right, between whites and reds. And the second question, Birobidzhan, right, the attempt to kind of encourage Jews to resettle to the autonomous region of Birobidzhan. So in terms of pogroms, the bloodiest pogrom was carried out by the Poles, because you don't have a pogrom in Minsk in 1881, 1882. In 1903, you have a pogrom in Gomel, but you don't have a pogrom in Minsk. Okay, in the city you don't have it, but you have an extremely bloody pogrom that is carried out by the Poles in 1918. The city is under Polish occupation. And actually, I was able to retrieve the words of Yechiel Abramsky, who maybe some of you know, the father of Shimon Abramsky, very important historian of Russian Jews, who actually wrote about Birobidzhan, so there you have the connection, not voluntary connection. And he actually, if you read that quote, if we read that quote, we think about the Shoah, we think about the Holocaust. What he was describing, he said, I am speechless, I see bodies on the streets, and we're talking, by the way, about I think it's 45 casualties, right? So compared to what will happen later, it's not very impressive, for us, right? But the way in which he captures his disillusionment with civilization, the Poles are now an independent European, well, not European, they're an independent state, and they are carrying out these, this massacre. They're killing civilians, and so that's very powerful. Okay, I could talk more about the pogroms and the extent to which Soviet Jews, younger Jews, embraced the Soviet Union because of what they had, because of the memory of violence from pre-1917, but I won't do that. Birobidzhan was not successful. I would say that it wasn't successful, and I do talk a little bit about it, in Belorussia, because of the Bundist tradition, or one of the reasons is the Bundist tradition and this idea of doikait, the here-ness. We stay here, and we work with what is here, we build here. In Ukraine, even in larger cities, the experiment of Birobidzhan, to the extent to which we can say that it was successful, it was more successful. Yes, the gentleman with glasses. Okay, I see what you're saying. I don't think that Minsk was unique. I mean, again, I'm using Minsk as a case study. I don't think that it was different from Zhytomyr. Zhytomyr was a little bit smaller than Minsk and never became a capital of a republic, but it's, in terms of population, Jewish population, very similar. Vinnytsia, also in Ukraine. Gomel is slightly small. I'm not saying that Minsk is unique in any way. And indeed, this, secularization, as you point out, begins very strongly at the end of during the 19th century. But I guess, what I looked at is that there are not only pressures from the state to secularize, but there are also pressures from friends and family, okay? If you live in Minsk, if you move to Minsk from a shtetl, you usually move with your family. You don't move by yourself, because if you want to move by yourself, you go to Moscow or Leningrad, right? So you move to Minsk with a family. you're moving from the shtetl, or you did not move from the shtetl. You have been in Minsk with your family. So there are pressures from the older generation there. You know, you go to the house of your parents for a Jewish holiday. So of course you're secular, and you tend to believe, or to want to believe, or to accommodate to the ideals of communism and consequently secularism. But there are other pressures that we have to keep in mind that haven't really been, I guess, considered before in the scholarship. From the vantage point of the Soviets, beginning, you know, it's in 1927 that any country that is outside of the Soviet Union is referred to as fascist. England is referred to as fascist in 1927. Now, we do know that, objectively speaking, Poland is moving very dramatically to the right. Beginning in 1935, the indexia is kind of, you know, encouraging anti-Semitism. You have pogroms. What is interesting is that these things are discussed in the Soviet Jewish press. The fact that there are pogroms, the fact that there are blood libels. This is why I became interested actually in the blood libel, which is my next book project. There is the Minsk newspaper. There is a blood libel in 1937 in the Soviet Union, and the people who accused the Jews of having killed a Belarusian who's found in the city, in the streets of the city, is ultimately, there is a public trial, and he's in prison for 1.5 years just to have him, just because he made that accusation. And on the other hand, in Poland, you do have ritual murder accusations against Jews that trigger pogroms. I mean, they don't happen every week, right? But there are such cases. And very often the police assumes that that's right, that actually happened, and the Jews are arrested. So the Soviet Jewish press does, and not only the Soviet Jewish press, by the way, the Belarusian press and the Russian press, even Pravda, does discuss instances of anti-Semitism. But to answer your question, for the Soviet Union, Poland is, you know, is a fascist country. And in the Jewish press, you do see how, you know, Jews describe these incidents of persecution against Polish Jews. And it's not only, you know, it's all Jews. You don't have that class distinction of bourgeois Jews in Poland who, in a way, deserve it, and the working class. No, in a way, you know, from the Soviet vantage point, of course. Okay, that's a good question. You do have many instances of resistance against Sovietization among religious Jews. Or at least they are described in the press as religious Jews. I believe that it wasn't actually only religious Jews. I'll just give you one example. The Talmud, the building of the Talmud Torah, the Talmud Torah in Minsk, which was a very old and very impressive building, I think I have an image of it in the book, is taken over by Jewish communists in 1923, because that's where they want to establish the YIVO Technicum, or, you know, this is the pedagogical institute, the Jewish Pedagogical Institute. And this, again, was the Talmud Torah. This was an institution, but it's not only a religious institution. It really was a symbol for the Jews. This is our building, right? This was the building of our fathers and mothers and grandparents. And so you really have a clash between Jewish communists and those who are described as religious Jews. But I believe that it wasn't only religious Jews. I'm pretty sure that there were even some Bundists who, you know, the Bund, after all, is dismantled in 1921, who were definitely secular, and who participated in that clash. Because it's a clash of more than 200 people, 200 Jews against the Jewish communists. And eventually the police is called it. So you do, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that I think that there was resistance to the Sovietization project, but the cases that we hear mostly about are described as cases initiated by religious Jews.
Excuse me, but by the late 30s, would you conclude there was no organized Jewish opposition?
Yes.
To the Soviet regime?
Yes, I would. Yes, I would. I would agree with that. It's not organized. Yeah, it's not organized. I mean, we do have, in the case of Minsk, there is one underground cell of the Poalei Zion, of the Socialist Zionist organization that exists. They meet until 1936, but ultimately they see themselves as being part of the Soviet Union. We don't agree with everything, but ultimately it's better here. I mean, it's the lesser of two or three evils. I mean, ultimately I guess that's how I would respond to that question. So they, affluent Jews, or bourgeois Jews, are identified as lichenzi, meaning that they are deprived of civil rights. They fall into the category of lichenzi. Now, it's not only affluent Jews who can be branded as lichenzi. It might also be former Bundists. It might. It's always rabbis and shochtim, for example, those who perform ritual slaughter. So it means that they are deprived of voting rights. That's the real definition. They are not allowed to vote. But if you're not allowed to vote in the Soviet Union, you have no civil rights, meaning that you have no access to health insurance, meaning that you cannot attend an institution of higher education, and your children cannot do that either. So you cannot go to school. So what we see is that very often the children of those who are branded as lichenzi move. The best way to escape is to go to Moscow and Leningrad. Just like people fled from the purges, if you were the son or the daughter of a very prominent politician in Minsk, for example, Jewish or non-Jewish, in 1938, the only way you could, avoid going to prison would be, fleeing very quickly. So, okay, so what happened to them? So the Yevsektia, the Jewish section of the Communist Party, tries to help them find some kind of livelihood, right? Because otherwise they will just, they'll have no income. And so what happens is that they are the ones who are kind of encouraged / forced to settle, to work the land and to settle in, Jewish kolkhozi, Jewish, agricultural settlements in Belorussia in general, or even in Crimea. Right, so that's more or less what happens to them. But it's not, so this, the branding of the lichenzi really goes in waves. And just to give you one example, the daughter of the Rabbi Gluskin, who was the rabbi in Minsk until 1931. In 1931, he moves to Leningrad, and he's the rabbi in Leningrad until 1936. His daughters did go to school. So there is, the theory and the practice. In theory, if you are the daughter, son of a Lishenyets, you cannot go to school. But they were going to school. And actually, they were even observing the Sabbath until 1929. Yes? Under the Soviets?
Yeah.
Under the Soviets? You do have cases in the 1920s of Jews who had very good connections and somehow had managed to hold on to some money, right? Who managed to get here. I actually do bring a few cases in, this is chapter 2, right, in the 1920s. And we do have cases of Jews who actually managed to get to Palestine. One of them is Harav Zimbalist Horodner, who was the rabbi who was crucial in setting up the underground religious institutions in Minsk in the 1920s and early 1930s, and he manages to get to the Soviet Union. Actually, to Palestine, I'm sorry. You do have a group of rabbis from the Soviet Union in general, not only from Minsk, who managed to get to. So, I mean, it wasn't easy. No, it wasn't easy, but it was possible. It was possible. And the authorities had the knowledge that these people were actually leaving. It's not like it was done secretly. Oh, there's so many questions. Yes, it's a very good question. Well, I mean, the first thing is that Jews were not specifically targeted as Jews, right, in the context of the purges of the late 1930s. And actually, the first national group that suffers during the Great Terror are the Poles. So the first national schools and national publications that are closed down are the Polish ones in 1937, actually 1 year before the Yiddish publications and Yiddish schools are closed down. And I think that Poles and Jews, more than others, were in a very, they were not in a good position, to say the least, because of the location of the city. And if you read, you know, Stalin was so preoccupied. You see how close Minsk is to the border. You see how close it is to Poland compared to Kiev, for example. This is the capital of a Soviet republic, and it's so close. You know, Stalin was convinced that convinced, we don't know if he was really convinced, but this is what he said, that Polish spies would come into Minsk and they would kind of take children, Polish children, and they would bring them back into Poland and grow them as, you know, and see them grow into fascist Poles, right, as opposed to Soviets. So there is this, you know, the spy mania. I think most historians agree that reaches a specific level in Belorussia that it doesn't elsewhere, well, specifically in Ukraine. That's one, the geopolitical location. The location of Minsk plays a role in the thoroughness and the extent of how systematic the purges were, the purges of the intellectual elites, of the national elites, right, the ethnic elites. But the other point that I bring, the other argument that I make is that the Yiddish experiment was very successful in Belarus. It was much more successful than it was in Ukraine. And this preoccupied the Soviets very much. And it has to do not only with the pre-revolutionary nature of this region and of the cities of Belorussia. Bundism, right? As opposed to Zionism, so Yiddish as opposed to Hebrew. I'm generalizing, of course, but and in Ukraine you have Zionism before you have Bundism. So it's not only that, but the Yiddish project, the Yiddish experiment was very successful in Minsk. And actually, if you look at the numbers, it was much more successful than it was in other cities in the Soviet Union. More Jewish children attended Yiddish schools than anywhere else, as Elias Schulman has shown already. I didn't have to go to the archives for that. So there was that degree of success that preoccupied very much the Soviets. That's why they close it down and they dismantle these institutions very systematically and thoroughly. However, not entirely, because we have the Belarusian Jewish State Theater that I showed you the image, right? This continues to be very active until 1941, until the Germans come in. You know, the actors leave the city right before the Germans come in, or the Soviet Yiddish press. It's not closed down. The Soviet Polish press is closed down. So as of 1937, you have nothing with a Polish word in Minsk. And Minsk was much more as a Polish city than it was a Belarusian city to some degree, historically speaking, if we go back to the 17th and 18th century. So so it's very complicated. I hope that I have provided more to. This was a synagogue, yes. The synagogue of wealthy Jews, the Zionist shul. It's now a Russian theater. It's now a Russian language theater. So after the war, this building was not destroyed during the war. But after the war, it was not, you know, actually, to go back to the question of, yes, you were trying to convince me to kind of look at continuities after World War II. I think that was one of your points. And there was an attempt, there was a petition made by some Jews who survived the war, returned to Minsk, because most Jews do not return to Minsk, but those who returned and who, you know, wanted to at least see the theater, the Belarusian Jewish theater, they do petition the higher authorities who say, this is a Bundist idea, I don't want to hear about it. And this, in the building, is given to the Russian theater. So the curriculum is standard throughout, you know, the Polish schools, Ukrainian schools. There were even, in Minsk, there was one school for 5 years. It was a German Soviet school, right? And there was one for gypsies, Roma and Sinti. But it was only for 5 years. Anyway, the curriculum is the same across the spectrum, meaning for every single ethnic national school. The only difference is the degree to which religion is attacked. Meaning that if you attend a Jewish school, it's the Jewish religion that is targeted specifically, or, you know, more vehemently, whereas if you attend a Polish school, it's Catholicism. But other than that, it's Marxism, historical materialism, you know, you do have about Russian history, and the languages are, of course, you know, if you look at a Jewish school, you know, the curriculum is taught in Yiddish, but you also have to learn Russian, Belarusian, and German. Yeah. So that's 4 languages, as opposed to if you go to a Russian language where you only have to learn German and Belarusian. Oh, yes, yes, yes. The idea is the merging of nations, right? So as Stalin famously said, you know, this has to be, you know, Soviet in content and national in form, you know, meaning that if, you know, the content is Marx, so let's say Marx face here, and but you can make the portrait using Yiddish letters, but the content is Marx, but you can express the content in Yiddish. So, yes. Well, the Jewish community of Minsk, right. So the archival sources, we were actually pretty lucky because the Minsk authorities, the party authorities, were not able to evacuate everything. I mean, they evacuated some people, but in terms of sources, in terms of archives, a large number was completely lost during the bombing of June 1941. But in terms of the interwar period, we have, I would say that we have most of the material that we would hope for is there. After the war, the material that especially that had to do with Yiddish institutions, with books in Yiddish and in Hebrew, all this material was actually brought to Kiev. We do have, I mean, I'm pretty sure that there still are some treasures in Minsk. There is no problem in terms of conducting research there as long as you don't deal with the war. The war is a problem. The partisan movements and the Jewish question, you know, if you go, just to give you an example, though I'm moving out of, you know, the topic specifically, but if you go to, in Minsk, there's the Museum of the Great Patriotic War, you know, which is still referred to in a very Soviet fashion, and there is a very famous image of a partisan woman that I'm sure that maybe some of you have seen, Masha Bruskina. When you work on the partisan movement, that's the image that every single scholar or person who reads about the partisan movement knows about, right? It's a very young woman who was 16 or 17, and she's been hanged by the Germans. And she's Jewish. I mean, the name Masha Bruskina is a very Jewish name. You know, it's like, I don't know, Moshe Lifshitz. I mean, Masha Bruskina is not a Russian name, and it's not, you know, for someone from there, it's clear. But if you go to this museum, it says unknown partisan, right? It still says unknown partisan there. So in other words, there is no problem in terms of working in the archives of the former Soviet Union in Minsk. I mean, the only thing you have to, it's not like here at YIVO where you go and you say, I'm looking for this, can you help me? And the archivist help us, right? You're there, they tell you we don't have anything. We have nothing. And then you have to come back the second day, the third. But so we have, to answer your question, most of the materials that have to do with Minsk, pre-revolutionary Minsk, were not destroyed. That's the answer. Pre-revolutionary and into war were not destroyed. I did not work so much on the post-war period. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much for the interest.